Hey, so this is part two, I guess you could say, of the Phillips curve. I'm going to I'm going to bypass the algebra portion because I'm not good at that, and me reading it out is not going to benefit you as far as I can tell, anyway. Anyway, so the instability of the Phillips curve. Consider the above, which I'm not going to read, but consider figure 18.3, which shows the combination. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, that's a different thing. Shows the combinations of the unemployment rate and the annual price inflation rate for the U.S. from 1948 to 2015. The logarithmic regression, there we go, between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate has been plotted for the three sub periods of 48 to 69. There's 19, by the way, in 1970 to 80 and 1981 to 2015. The repression line for the period of 1948 to 69 fits the data quite well and shows a simple Phillips curve trade-off of the type depicted in 18.2. However, consider the observation for 1970 to 1980. Those data are clearly inconsistent with a stable Phillips curve and seem to imply a positively sloping relationship. This apparent shift in the Phillips curve which was considered to be a collapse in the relationship and led to accusations that the underlying conceptualization of the Keynesian Phillips curve was flawed. In the 1980s, when inflation moderated, it became hard to determine any relationship between inflation and unemployment in the U.S. economy. From an empirical perspective, then, the belief that the Phillips curve was a stable relationship which could be exploited in a predictable manner by policymakers according to their preferences between inflation and unemployment had become highly questionable. We always have to be very careful when we visualize data in this way. First, the choice of dates for the different periods is important. Second, the observations between 1970 and 1980 may in fact signify a shifting Phillips curve relationship, and the regression line is just picking up picking up the shifting function. However, the trade-off to be empirically sustained, it is necessary for consecutive annual observations to define a trade-off via econometric estimation and rational needs to be provided as to whether or not the trade-off is shifting. The idea of stagflation that Lerner advanced in the early 1950s, which was gone through in chapter 17, would also help to understand, which I'll go here. I'll go with that sometime this week is chapter 17. Would also help to understand the empirical instability in the Phillips curve that began to manifest in the late 1960s and led to a major shift in macroeconomic thinking. And let's see, econometric misspecification. It was known that the Phillips curve became unstable, moved around in the late 1960s, and was particularly susceptible to sudden and or large increases in inflation. The econometrically estimated consumption functions in the large macroeconomic policies models that were popular in the 1960s also became unstable in the 1970s. Some economists successfully showed that the failure of the large-scale econometric models maintained by governments and central banks in the early 1970s to forecast variables such as savings and consumption could be traced to the misspecification of the consumption function. Most of these models ignored the possibility that rising inflation would influence consumption. For example, If consumers expect prices to rise quickly in the future, they may bring forward consumption decisions. The breakdown of the Phillips curve in the late 1960s demonstrated that another econometric function had been misspecified. There we go, because it is ignored the possibility that rising inflation might become self-fulfilling as workers and firms sought to protect their real wages and real profit margins. This meant that an inflationary expectations term should have been included in the equation. In other words, it wasn't a part of the original equation. It is a fact, though, that the mainstream Keynesian consensus in the 1960s was abstracted from the potential instability rooted in the institutional nature of wage and price setting. Instead, policymakers pursued the attractive notion that they could permanently maintain low employment as no, maintain low unemployment as long as they ensured that effective demand was sufficient. Given the non-government sector's saving plans and any demand leakages from net exports, another reason why the discussion about instability were largely ignored is that the textbook model of the Phillips curve was very attractive in its simplicity. Textbooks typically stylize discussions and eschew complicated stories for the sake of pedagogy. I'm not really sure that's the right way of saying it, but anyway. We have taken care to resist this tendency in this text. We consider a rich treatment of institutions and history to be an important part of learning macroeconomics. And the accelerationist hypothesis and the expectations augment Phillips curve. The introduction, the legacy of the earlier Keynesian versus classic debate persisted through the 1950s and 1960s. The neoclassical school was unwilling to accept the basics insights provided by Keynes that effective demand drives output and national income, and that the capitalist monetary system is susceptible to crisis and overproduction and unemployment. In the late 1960s, the ongoing debate about the effectiveness of fiscal and monetary policy is stabilizing the economic cycle was revisited within the Phillips curve framework. A group of economists centered at the largely reflected their belief that a self-regulating free market would generate optimal outcomes. Thus, they were largely reflected their Thus, they were inherents of the neoclassical model that considered most government intervention to be problematic. See the discussion of the orthodox neoclassical approach in the first chapter. This debate at the macroeconomic level was manifested in demands for widespread deregulation in product, labor, and financial markets, and a major reduction in the size of government. At the macroeconomic level, the Phillips curve was the contested battleground. During the stable Phillips curve policy era, policymakers assumed that they could target a low unemployment rate and incur a modest inflation rate as a consequence. The extent to which inflation rose was determined by the slope of the Phillips curve, which was considered to be relatively low, so the Phillips curve was close to being flat. The emerging Chicago monetarists who eschewed government intervention challenged the view and asserted that there was no permanent long-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. They claimed that ultimately the market would ensure unemployment stabilized at around its so-called natural rate, and that The attempts by the government to push unemployment below this rate would lead to escalating inflation. Chicago economist Milton Friedman was the most vocal monetarist and, in a famous article in 1968, outlined what became known as the accelerationist hypothesis. Expectations of inflation. As seen the boxes of expectations of inflation on an historic note, which is probably just going to, the English economist author Joseph Brown published The Great Inflation in 1955, 3 years before Phillips came out with his work. Brown not only foresaw the instability of the wage-unemployment relationship, but also recognized that the development of a wage-price spiral is dependent on the aims of the two parties who are competing for the real income of the country or their success in achieving those aims. It is reminiscent of the literature we examined in Chapter 17, which depicts the inflation process as resulting from the incompatible claims on total nominal income by workers and firms. Brown also understood in making these claims that the antagonists formed expectations of the future price movements. For example, workers want to protect the real equivalent of their wage incomes and make money wage demands accordingly. As seen in box 18.1, the introduction of the so-called expectation augmented Phillips curve by Friedman in 1968 did not represent a sudden new discovery that expectation of inflation is wage adjustment or are imported. Rather, the emergence and promotion of the model can be seen as the culmination of a long campaign by Friedman and others to restore the quantitative theory to the status it had prior to the Keynesian Revolution. Friedman and Edmund Phelps, who in 1968 also authored an important paper incorporating expectations into the Phillips curve, have thus wrongly been given the credit for the introduction of an expectation into the Phillips curve. In raising the issue of its stability, however, it was the empirical instability in the relationship between unemployment and inflation that opened the way for the so-called monetarist paradigm in macroeconomics to gain ascendancy. The monetarists reinterpreted the inflation/unemployment trade-off by adding the role of inflationary expectations, and in doing so revived the classical pre-Keynesian notion of a natural unemployment rate defined as equivalent to full employment. The devastating consequences of this assertion was the rejection of a role for demand management policies to reduce unemployment to its frictional component. The Keynesians had adopted the Phillips curve, a macroeconomic relationship, yet they had developed a very little macroeconomic theory to underpin it with. They had justified the Phillips curve as a competitive adjustment process, such that if there was growing demand for labor, money, wages rose as unemployment fell. But monetarists claimed that workers cared about real wages rather than nominal wages because the real wage represented a worker's capacity to buy goods and services. Thus, the original Phillips curve was a defective because it could only focus on the relationship between percentage changes in money, wages, and the unemployment rate, and ignored the influence of a changing price level on expectations about inflation. I will go back more into this tomorrow. Stay tuned, and if you like this education, as I've recently had to change the category of my videos from entertainment, for some reason it was internet entertainment, to education, please subscribe, please follow, please like, share, and comment. And share the what out of this, and also go to realprogressives.org for more MMT related materials. Macro and cheese is on there 8 a.m. 8 a.m. Saturdays. So it was yesterday. It's a tremendous episode there. So check it out at realprogressives.org, and check out Grand Gamer 71 on Twitch, YouTube, TikTok. Excuse me, TikTok, Twitter, and other places. Same thing with Real Progressives, except they also real progress in action here on YouTube. For now, peace out for now.